So in '76, researchers discovered the Ebola virus. And since its emergence, how are we doing? Can you hear me? All right, good. Since its emergence, it's taken the lives of about 13,000 people. And that's a horrifying disease, but, hello. Yeah, I know. Too big for life. This is a horrifying disease, but we know that with relatively simple improvements in care and access to care, those impacted even by Ebola had much better outcomes pretty quickly. Now, in the last 10 years, you've seen what has killed at least twice that many people in Central America and Mexico alone. And with recent studies, we know this epidemic isn't new. And currently, we're sharing data with our colleagues all over the world, and we're seeing what appears to be similar epidemics, even in the USA, Mexico, India, Thailand, Brazil. This is not some little regional problem. And we believe that this disease has flown under the radar because the population's affected. These are populations that nobody was paying attention to. But what we also believe is this epidemic, in a way like Ebola, though very different, has ways to be treated that are relatively simple and improve the outcome distinctly. So just in Central America, which is what we mostly are talking about today and where we really found out about this disease, we've lost at least, in just 10 years, 20,000 lives in Central America and Mexico alone. And one reason this disease has really kind of flown under the radar, I think, as well, is those who are affected, people that are a part of society that aren't really valued as they should be, these workers that don't get the treatment or the surveillance they deserve. Is they're affected by a disease, chronic kidney disease, that has many of the same symptoms and outcomes of a more traditional form that's caused by hypertension, diabetes, and obesity. So herein lies an irony. In the developed world, we're suffering from an epidemic of traditional kidney disease. And that's been brought on by an increasingly sedentary lifestyle, though you in Holland are doing a bit better on your bikes, and the overconsumption of sugars, which have absolutely contributed to an epidemic of obesity, hypertension, and type 2 diabetes, which are all massive contributors to kidney disease. So meanwhile, to meet that global diet, and the cultivation of sugar has grown both in terms of land under cane and the amount of intensity, the amount of cane produced on that land. And that has a lot to do with, we think, the disease, why workers are working much harder to produce more cane cut per ton. In the case of CKD and chronic kidney disease of non-traditional cause, those affected rarely have the traditional risk factors. And in the most impacted areas, it's an incredible amount of people. It's 42% of the men are impacted. So that's, half the men, about half, just under half the men in this room, if you look around, would be impacted by this fatal disease. And if you look at this incredibly impacted community and the wider city around it, if you look at the statistics from 2002 until 2012, 16,000 total years of life have been lost due to the disease compared to the regional average. And that's in a city of just 35,000 people. So who's affected? Nearly all of them are heavy laborers. And though we see this illness, or what appears to be a related illness in Sri Lanka and India, among rice farmers and coconut farmers, we also see it in miners and port workers and construction workers in Central America. It disproportionately affects sugarcane workers. And while the disease is really deemed to be chronic, the average age of death for a sugarcane worker in the most impacted regions is about 46 years old. And we've already seen that men as young as 20 and 30 are frequently being claimed. So this really should be viewed as a death sentence. This is a shot. Ed and I did our first trip, yeah? And this gentleman is paid by the city. So instead of the city and the government in Nicaragua, investing in prevention or investing in intervention to try to figure out what's going on, as they actually did to their credit in Costa Rica recently, started doing studies, The attitude of the government of Nicaragua has been to pay the coffin worker to make more coffins for those impacted and those who die of this disease. And we just thought this was such a powerful shot. I mean, this is this guy's life, and these are his neighbors, and he's surrounded by this huge quantity of wood to make these coffins for these daily funerals. So what is the cause? Well, I mean, we're a pretty cautious bunch. We're not the yelling, screaming activist types. We really let the data tell the story. And the data is kind of steering us away from what was the initial inclination, which is it must be a toxin. And what we do know from the data, what we can say is that heat stress, workload, and muscle degradation are leading to this disease. And sugarcane has always been brutal. And as you increasingly industrialize that job, it becomes more brutal. And if you also consider the fact that now, across the board, workers are paid by ton cut, and they have to cut more to both provide for their families and also because of increasing demands and quotas set by companies. These guys are losing as much water as a marathon runner on a daily basis, and that's during a 6-month harvest. They're burning as many calories as a half marathon runner a day, and they have the cardiac strain and workload of that of a special forces soldier on a 3-day deployment. So that's like a SEAL on a special operations mission. And they're doing that, though, without breaks in between. They're doing that without rest time. And they're doing that again and again and again for 6 months at a time. So as Ramon said, it's really not that much of a mystery as to why that might fry your kidneys. What's really also disturbing is when you look at these risk factors of the heat stress and the workload, is these guys are getting sick in as fast as one harvest. So what are we doing? We're consulting with the U.S. Army Environmental Research Institute. We're collaborating with the Center for Disease Control's National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. And we're working with the U.S. Department of Labor's Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And while we think that there's a toxin component that could be at play, that hasn't been proven, but we're not ruling it out completely, and therefore we're working with London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Imperial College London, Lund University in Sweden, and next year's Center for Disease Control of the USA, their NIOSH, National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, will be working with us to analyze those environmental risks. So if there is a poison, we will find it and we'll figure out how to mitigate it along with the other known risk factor. And I think that's something to kind of digest is the data says that the heat stress, the muscle breakdown from the repetitive muscle injury of swinging that machete, and the dehydration alone is enough to cause this repeated damage and lead to chronic disease. That is verified in animal models, and that is demonstrated again and again as we're looking more at the human and field studies. But if you add in a toxin component to that, you're looking at a real tragedy. And I think we have to either rule it in or out. But I think to be absolute about it at this stage is foolhardy because the current studies have been wanting. And I think we need a really great protocol, and I think we have a good start with NIOSH. So what are we doing in the meantime? Well, we're acting where we can act, and I think that's the responsible thing to do. I mean, I think this is what Ramon really sent home. And I don't want to beat it over the head, but we have a way forward, and it's the Worker Health and Efficiency Program, and that program really has had a great impact already. Just from the Costa Rican government knowing we're doing that, seeing our latest studies, seeing their own studies, seeing related studies from other colleagues, they have decreed by presidential decree, just in July, I believe, that workers in hot, strenuous environments must have access to water, rest, and shade. That is now law, and it's an evolving law and regulation in Costa Rica. And it's not general. This is where it's the kicker. This is what you work for as an NGO, I think, is to change policy, then hope the enforcement happens. It is directly in context to CKD-NT. That law is to prevent the onset of that disease. So what we're trying to do is find an effective, affordable way to intervene for these mills and for other producers. So basically we're taking OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Agency's Water, Rest, and Shade program, and modifying it for sugarcane work. And what we did is we took a tent that moves with the harvest. So, the guy starts out here, and, an hour later he's 100 meters down, but the water used to be at a bus that was already 200 meters behind him. He's getting paid by ton cut. So he's not going to walk all the way down that line and cut and return to get water or shade or take a break. So what we did is we created a tent that moves with water in it and moves with that line of production. And they have camelbacks on as well. And that camelback provides access to water, because access to water is as important as how much water somebody drinks. Because if you have already been exposed to that heat stress and that dehydration, the acute kidney damage that's causing the damage in the body is already happening. So when you drink the water at the end of the day, it's too late. So you have to have the access. The other thing we're doing is improving ergonomics and improving the machete. The machete these guys are using is terrible. It used to cause them an enormous amount of muscle pain, which led to the consumption of anti-inflammatories, which are also nephrotoxic. And that seems to have been eliminated with the new machete. And that's kind of a fun story in all of this. The reason we realized this machete was viable is there's an old-time Australian guy named Paul Donnelly. And what we always say about Paul Donnelly is if he had a movie, the tagline would be, the only thing he can't do is die. Paul's 72, and even at 55, he cut a ton of cane in 13 minutes. He used to cut more than 15 tons a day. He's been bitten by a taipan snake, which is like the third most poisonous in the world, 3 times, thusly surviving the anti-venom reaction twice. He's had his eardrum eaten out by an ant, or ants, plural, after a car wreck, probably caused by a kangaroo. And you get to when you're in the audience or the presence of a legend, you know it. And what he did about 12 years ago is he went down to Colombia and Brazil, and he brought kind of the craft the Australian cane cutters used to be able to bring in the 70s, because they had water, they had rest, they had shade, they were paid really well. And it was a craft, it was a job, it wasn't kind of just toil. And they had figured out how to do this job better. So he's improving the logistics down in Brazil and Colombia. He's bending this machete in this way that's much more efficient for use. And like a game of telephone, it makes its way up to Central America, but the Central American producers and machete producers just kind of phoned it in. They were like, oh, we could either pay the Australian to come over here, or we could just kind of try it ourselves. And they made this god-awful machete that's really kind of like a spatula. So the ergonomics are way off. And then what Paul did is we brought him in. He finally came to Central America, and he went over with the workers, and we saw great results. So that's a really important, I think, story about farmer knowledge, and then how we're quantifying that, and we're measuring it, and we're trying to improve the tool and improve the cutting system, right down to how many rows they cut, how they lay the cane, everything. All these little changes that reduce workload, reduce muscle fatigue, and also increase efficiency. And yeah, there's Paul at 72 years old, cutting cane with the guys to prove his point. And teaching them, yeah. It was amazing. When he showed up, the guys were like, who's this gringo? This old man. And he gets out there and he just starts swinging away, and they're like, oh. And it was pretty much instant uptick. It was really wonderful to see. So what are the results? It's year 1. And I think it's really important to recognize this is a pilot. Pilots are there to prove viability. You need many, many more numbers and support. Support's needed for this, for the mills taking the first steps to increase the numbers, to increase the proof, because it's just a pilot. You're trying to see, is this viable? Is this cost effective? And what are the initial results? But they're really, I think, exceeded any reasonable expectation. They doubled their water intake. When I did this very similar talk in the Philippines last year at a Bonsuco conference, I heard all these, with all due respect to whoever they were, these people giving me these behavioral psychology excuses why the guys don't drink water, and it's a custom and this and that. And I was like, no, it's because they don't have access to water. The water is a half a kilometer away. That's why they're not drinking water. It's not because they're silly campesinos. That's racist. But people don't mean to be that way. They're just trying to come up with a reason as why is this situation that seems so simple so ridiculous? And that's a really good fundamental question. But the fact is, when people have a backpack of water on and when they have a mandatory break, they drink water. So now they're drinking, instead of 2 to 4 liters a day, they're drinking 7 to 9. So insulation, think of the water not just about how much, but also the access. There's an insulation against the threat. And heat stroke is really dangerous. And we don't know if it's correlated with the disease itself or not, but that can kill you outright. And it's a huge problem in the United States of America. And right now, we're working with NIOSH and OSHA to see if this disease is happening in the San Joaquin Valley and in the Coachella production valleys, because those are also kind of invisible populations of migrants, and nobody was really asking the question. And the thing that kind of triggered that intrigue also is the amount of people dying of heat stroke. And so we're looking at that. So once we rolled out the intervention with this group in January, after 2 months of harvest, we saw no more heat stroke. And this is the big one, and this is also, I think Ramon would agree, where we need to exercise some caution, because it's a small group, it's a group of 60 workers. But when we looked at the first 2 months of the harvest, there was about a 6% drop in kidney function. That's precipitous, that's huge, in the filtration rate of their kidney. And after the intervention, it flatlined. It's totally stabilized throughout the harvest. And the reason you have to expand the numbers and expand the study is you really need to verify something like that, because that is groundbreaking. That is what Ramon's talking about. There is a huge possibility that we are at that before and after point, because that's what you're looking for. You're looking like, are you stopping damage? Are you stabilizing filtration? And only by expanding this and getting further support are we going to be able to prove that and be able to systemize this. And here's a big one for a few people in the room, I imagine. Let that sink in. These guys are cutting 3.8 tons per person. El Salvador is a little low on the grand scale of things as far as productivity in general. And when we introduced just water, rest, and shade first with OSHA, we saw a 10% increase. And when Paul came and did his thing, and our friend Robert from Australia also, we saw another 30% the week after the next week. The next week, what we saw is what you would expect. There's a dip, because people are onboarding. They're onboarding the information. But even including that dip from the intervention inclusion, we saw a 40% increase. They're cutting about 5.6, I believe, per person was the average. So the real question is, who's going to be our next supporter? I'm putting it out there. I've done one of these talks every year for 4 years. At Bon Sucro, all over the place. So I think it's really time that people support the mills that are taking the initiative. I think it's time that people who source from their own mills take the initiative, find out what's going on. And I think it's a really positive story, because that's just in the pilot. Like we can get that up there with systemization. And so, for now, you can find out more at our website, and it's no one owns this website. Anybody can have this website. Tag it to your own accounts, to your own web pages, and it's weprogram.org. And get the word out. And in the meantime, we're going to be looking at the toxins and looking at how to prevent any of the other risks for these guys. So thanks a lot.